the Grand Nizam of Hyderabad, a South Indian kingdom that lasted from the 1720s until 1948. By the time of India's independence, the Nizam was the wealthiest man in the world. He also reputedly had closet space that was over 1 kilometer in length. Seen at all the ceremonies of the Raj, the Nizam was a staunch loyalist to the British and was very wary of the mass mobilizations of Gandhi and Indian nationalists. How is it that given the rise of Indian nationalism and the fact that the Nizam himself was Indian, that he did not generally support Indian nationalists? Why did he not want independence and freedom from the British? What is it that made him wary of the power of the Indian masses? When Gandhi was advocating a return to the rustic simplicity of the self-sufficient Indian peasantry, Indian princes had never been so lavish, rich, and splendid in their lives. In this lecture, we're going to examine the role of the Indian princely states under colonialism and try to understand where they came from and how the British influenced them. Specifically, we're going to examine 3 major themes to better understand the dynamics of how the British exercised what we can call indirect rule across 2/5 of the Indian subcontinent. First, we're going to examine the origins of the princely states and why they technically were separate from directly controlled British territory. Second, we'll look at how the British cultivated ties of loyalty and affection with these princes and how they became staunch loyalists. Thirdly, and finally, we're going to examine the difficult balancing act the British had to play in keeping these traditional rulers in place, while at the same time demonstrating how modernizing British rule actually was. This is an often overlooked chapter of India's colonial history. The princely states were quickly absorbed by the independent states of India and Pakistan after 1947. The Indian nationalists wanted to consign these princely states to the dustbin of history. But they played a crucial role, actually, in maintaining British power and influence throughout the Indian subcontinent. Now, let's start with an overview of what we would call princely India. India has known kings for thousands of years. The ancient Indian treatises, such as the Arthashastra, were effectively manuals for how the king should rule his empire and domains. Indeed, the caste system itself had a place for rulers, the Kshatriyas, or as they're known across northern India, Kshatris. They were known as Rajas and Maharajas, or great kings. With the coming of the Mughals, as we've seen, most regional kingdoms in 18th century India were ruled by Muslims. They were usually called either Nizams or Nawabs. And remember, crucially, the British had dislodged most of these Muslim regional kingdoms from power between the 1700s and the 1840s. But were the British able to conquer all of these Indian kingdoms? Well, no. India's a big place. There were 2 phases in how the British dealt with these Indian-ruled regional kingdoms. Before the 1850s, as we've seen, the company was much more confrontational and bellicose towards them. We saw how they bullied the Nawabs of Awadh, the Amirs of Sindh, and the Sikh kings who ruled the Punjab. Defer to kingly authority, the British ironically didn't. Traditionally, under the Mughals, vakils, who were agents or intermediaries between rulers, were allowed to be posted in provinces. And initially, the company continued this practice, allowing rulers from Hyderabad, Mysore, and the central Indian kingdom of Gwalior to post vakils in Calcutta. But this only lasted until the 1820s, when the company decided to cut the Indian middlemen out. The British wanted to control the channels of communication of these Indian princely states. So, after the 1820s, the British monopolized this channel of diplomatic communication by maintaining all lines of communication with British envoys. Now, this was crucial, for without the ability to freely and officially communicate outside your borders, a state really can't be sovereign. So the company did its fair share of royal rattling up through the period of its rule. We also saw how the company used the subsidiary alliance to push kingdoms like Awadh, Jhansi, and Satara into debt, which, incidentally, put them into the company's fiscal orbit. But all of this changed after the uprising of 1857. So how might now the British view old traditional leaders of Indian society after an uprising that nearly tossed the British into the oceans? Remember, the company had done a lot of reform between the 1830s and 1857. So after the uprising, the British, wary of meddling too much in Indian tradition and sensibilities, started to see Indian princes as a source of stability. Because they were fearful of upsetting Indian sensibilities, the British resorted to what they viewed as traditional authority as a means of buttressing their rule. They now started to see these older Maharajas, Nizams, and Nawabs not as the autocratic despots they'd seemed to be during the Company era, but in fact, they were now seen as markers of stability. Basically, the British decided to consolidate what they couldn't conquer. They knew that if they were not going to undertake further territorial expansion, they had to find ways to maintain influence in those regions not under direct British rule. So they started to treat Nizams and Maharajas with somewhat more respect. And the British recognized more princes and hereditary titles than ever before. For example, after the 1850s, the British granted more sanads, or letters of recognition, to princes. Under the Company, such recognition was arguably much more difficult for Indian princes to obtain. The doctrine of lapse, which we saw was used in numerous kingdoms, was repudiated, as was further territorial expansion. Princes were now allowed to continue their male lineage. And the British saw these Indian kings as valuable, really, for the stability of colonial rule. One official said, quote, "If we are wise, we shall lose no time in binding ourselves to the chiefs, the landlords, great and small, and the wealthy classes by stronger and more substantial ties." Clearly a reference to the kings of India. Another official commented that ties with the Indian princes would be, quote, "worth in an army of European troops." The value that the British placed in Indian princes should, of course, really be viewed in the context of how British attitudes changed after the 1857 uprising. After the shock of the uprising and rebellion, many British officials felt that the cause of it was really a meddling in Indian traditions as a result of the liberal reformist generation. The Grease Cartridge affair, to them, could have been prevented. So to the British, one way to keep India stable was to rule through, and indeed cultivate, its more traditional rulers. The logic went like this. If Indian Maharajas, Nawabs, and Nizams, with whom Indians of all walks of life were familiar, then perhaps these rulers, rather than the British themselves, could reform Indian society and politics without provoking a strong backlash. Here, the messenger was really important. There was also the question of legitimacy after 1857. The British were slightly aware of Indian opinion, in some respects. They hoped that cozying up and supporting traditional Indian authority would make the British look less bad in a post-uprising era. It was hoped this would make the British look slightly more deferential and sensitive to Indian sensibilities. After all, the rapid overthrowing of Indian princes and Nawabs between 1840 and 1856 seemed to contribute to the outbreak of violence a year later. So the British, after 1857, started to cultivate what they saw as the natural leaders of Indian society. Now, let's talk about the geographic scale of the Indian princely states. These Indian princely states accounted for about 2/5 of the Indian subcontinent's territories, and about 2/5 of India's entire population. This was a large chunk of India. This, in total, covered 500,000 square miles and over 90 million subjects. Some of these kingdoms, such as Hyderabad, were larger than even some states in Europe. Of course, when it came to cultivating royal relationships, the British had an excellent hand. They were ruled, after all, by a queen and a monarchy, of which they were very proud. So here's what the British did. In 1877, Queen Victoria was made Empress of India. Now here, the semantics are really significant. The specific Indian title she was given was Qaisar-e-Hind, meaning the Caesar of India. Now let's think about it. If Caesar comes from the word Caesar, what kind of rule does this suggest the British wanted in India? Certainly not a democratic one, a more traditional rule. Can you see how this dovetailed with the post-1857 caution that largely characterized the Raj and its attitudes? To the British, it seemed that meddling in traditional Indian sensibilities would do nothing but cause widespread revolt. The activities of utilitarians, missionaries, and reformers were all seen to have contributed to this mess. Indian society, therefore, started to become seen by the British as layered, ordered, and traditional. And so it seemed best not to even mess with tradition. A large section of the subcontinent, as we can see, never came under direct British rule. But if we look very closely at the map, bearing in mind chronology, it kind of makes sense. Outwards from Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta is where the British acquired direct rule over their Indian territories. Concordantly, the largest concentration of princes that survived were in western and central India, where British influence came much later. But in eastern and southern India, where British power first arrived, most of these kingdoms were gone by the mid-19th century. Now, not all of these kingdoms were the same. They varied immensely. There were over 600 of them. Some could be very big and small. Some were less than a square kilometer in size. Others, like Hyderabad, were roughly the size of France. And like all royals, the ruler's eccentricities were, well, eccentric. Just to give you a few examples, the Maharaja of Patiala, near northern Punjab, purportedly consumed 25 quail daily, and on the day of his death ate a 10-egg omelet. The Nawab of Jaora was an avid golfer and was even driven from tee to tee in his personally customized Rolls-Royce. The Maharaja of Jind in the Punjab was a true night owl. He woke up every day at 4 p.m. and went to bed at 4 a.m. He lavishly consumed 25 pegs of brandy every day and insisted on bathing with only select French bath salts. He was declared medically deaf, but had curiously developed the ability to read people's lips. The Maharaja of Gwalior had a silver electric train at his dining table that carried nuts, fruits, and liquor for his stately dinner with guests. The Nawab of Junagadh once spent 200,000 rupees on a diamond collar for his pet dog. And one Maharaja spent over 1 million rupees on a wedding between his pet dog and another pet dog. A state holiday was declared for 3 days, and vans of free food were parked in the town center. Even a Brahmin Pandit conducted the religious ceremony in traditional Orthodox manner. The Nawab of Rampur used to treat his guests to his viewing of his 200 radio sets and his own personal jazz band. And perhaps more famously, one Nizam of Hyderabad, Osman Ali, had a penchant for taking nude photos of his European guests with hidden cameras. And to add to this eccentricity, he used to watch surgical operations in his city's central hospital. Maintaining over 200 wives and concubines, he was reported to, quote, cumulatively procreate at the rate of 1 offspring every 4 months. He certainly lived large. But eccentricities aside, these princely states also varied considerably in terms of how they governed and administered. Some kingdoms were known for being moderately progressive, and even more so than those territories under direct British rule. These included princely states such as Mysore and Baroda. Others remained, though, somewhat feudal from the outside, dabbled very little in modernizing their rule and administrations. Now, this is all good and well, but this newfound affinity for India's more traditional rulers didn't prevent the British from interfering in these kingdoms. Meddling continued after the uprising, but it was much more cautious and clandestine, a lot like the very surreptitious modernization which was being done in the rest of India through telegraphs, railways, and the colonial bureaucracy. Now, let's turn to the ways in which the British tried to keep influence in these kingdoms. Remember, they were not subject to the laws of British-ruled India. So let's think. If the British couldn't rule these regions directly, how might they exert influence? Well, the British exercised something we've called indirect rule. These Indian princely states were subject to British indirect rule. Even though they were never formally under British rule, they could be made amenable to British interests. This is because they both had a lot in common. The British and Indian rulers were both somewhat fearful of rapid and sudden change. They both largely identified with more traditional sources and ethos of authority. Why else was indirect rule favored? Well, think about it. How much did it cost? Very little. The British didn't have to pay for the administration. This was a form of what we could call empire on the cheap. It cost the British much less to influence them and follow their interests. This, though, required collaboration and compromise with established Indian rulers. But it generally maintained British hegemony without requiring them to annex more territory, administer it, and drain the ledger book of the Raj. So this is how the British did it. It was called the residency system. The British maintained an envoy known as a resident, sort of like an ambassador at every kingdom. Now, this resident would, in various degrees, advise on matters of state, relay messages from the viceroy, etc. The resident was the main intermediary between the princely states and the British Raj. Now, given that the British ruled India, what is one way they could really influence these princes? Well, think about it. They could control their foreign relations. It's interesting. These princes were technically sovereign, but they were cut off from the outside world. They were not allowed to maintain diplomatic relations with one another, let alone outside governments. So the Raj monopolized their diplomacy and communication. The princes also couldn't possess independent military forces. They either had to be regiments under British command as part of the army or work within the existing armed forces of the British. This had significant effects. Making the princes dependent upon the British ensured that, in a way, they were less likely to criticize the Raj and its policies. It often kept princes meddling in peasant grievances against high taxes. Okay, now that we've covered the background and how the British channeled the princes' states into the Raj, let's turn to look at how they more specifically cultivated loyalty and bonds. The British couldn't just tell princes what to do. That was very simple. They had to manage relationships with over 600 different princes, and they had to be nice to them. So what they did was to cultivate ties of loyalty and affection, and this was done mainly through symbolism and ritual. The British wanted to appear to the princes and indulge them in royal splendor through personal, loyal relationships. Remember, before modern bureaucracies and state structures, this is how ruling was done across the world, and it was something with which princes could easily identify. And in some instances, it really paid off. The Maharaja of Jaipur had his city painted pink and had the city's Albert Hall built in honor of a forthcoming visit by the Prince of Wales in 1876. This was a practice that the historian David Cannadine has called ornamentalism. It was the importance of ritual and trappings of a feudal type of rule with its hierarchy. It was the idea that you could cultivate feelings of loyalty with pomp, splendor, and grandeur of a far much older age. And here are some ways the British did it. They held huge royal gatherings called darbars, coming from the Persian word for court, darbar. These occurred more frequently after the 1860s. Now, darbars were really interesting. They were used to display visual and ceremonial solidarity with India's princes, and to make the British, in spite of their savage tax demands and economic parasitism, look like legitimate rulers in the eyes of Indians. Perhaps the best example was the Imperial Assemblage of Delhi in 1877. This was a huge logistical undertaking. It was colored by rank, status, titles, and formal royal pronouncements. And the Delhi Durbar of 1911 was even greater in scope, scale, and splendor. These were grand displays of honor, pomp, and ceremony, almost meant to tingle the mind and heart into thinking that Maharajas and the British who supported them were good, benevolent rulers. Now think about it. What else do royals like to have so that they can put on their uniforms and gowns that make them feel good? You got it. Honors and titles. It's fair to say that the British showered Indian princes with honors and titles. In fact, many of the honors and titles for the British Empire were initially established specifically for Indian princes. They were meant to engender a sense of affection and loyalty to the British crown, more than the colonial state itself. Remember, the Raj was, technically speaking, representative of Her Majesty's government. The crown and its accompanying pomp and ceremony were what mattered in this Raj-princely state relationship. Here are some great examples of titles created for Indian princes. One title was called the Most Exalted Order of the Star of India, established in 1861. In 1878, the Most Eminent Order of the Indian Empire and the Imperial Order of the Crown of India were also established. Other lesser ones included Companion of the Star of India, CSI, and the Companion of the Indian Empire, CIE. Of course, who would be more likely to get these titles? Well, those princes who were perceived to be the most loyal to the British. And of course, there was competition for these titles. Like royalty the world over, Indian princes competed fiercely with each other for honor, status, and importance. The famed British Indian novelist Rudyard Kipling, in one of his novels, mocked the extent to which some Rajas and Nizams went to achieve these honors. Now just bear this in mind, CSI stands for Companion of the Star of India, and CIE stands for Companion of the Indian Empire, which is a lower-ranked title than CSI. Rustam Beg of Kolazai, slightly backward native state, lusted for a CSI, so began to sanitate. Built a jail and a hospital, nearby built a city drain, till his faithful subjects all thought their ruler was insane. Then the birthday honors came. Sad to state and sad to see, stood against the Raja's name, nothing more than CIE. Now, this trend towards cultivating Indian princes, though, was also crucially shaped by events back in Britain. The Raj's championing of the natural leaders of Indian society as sources of legitimacy did reflect growing unease about what was actually changing back home in Britain. Now, let's ask ourselves, what was happening to British politics and the whole political system during the 19th century? Well, as we remember, it was, albeit stubbornly, becoming more democratic and accountable to its people. It was eventually becoming a democracy. So to those who were wary of this, aristocrats, romanticists, and reactionaries, India offered an escape. Remember that by 1900 in Britain, landed interest and the dominance of the aristocracy had largely given way to a more democratic and capitalistic, less landed system of power and economy. The powers of wealth and the aristocracy were on the wane by the end of the 19th century in Britain, with political reform and a degree of democratization emerging. The positions, though, that made up the higher echelons of the colonial rule and the Raj were largely held by lesser aristocrats, and they were losing out back home. India, in a way, was a safety valve for domestic British aristocratic decline and disillusionment with modern politics that had to deal with increasingly vocal and demanding constituents. As the historian Francis Hutchins has put it, quote, India seemed to offer the prospect of aristocratic security at a time when England itself was falling prey to democratic vulgarity. Now, what else could princely states supply to larger British imperial needs? What would connect them? Well, troops and military manpower. It's important to stress that the princes were a significant source of military strength. After the 1850s, especially because of the Great Uprising, Indian princes actually became generous donors and supporters of the British imperial cause. Princes had previously supplied the company with troops to fight its expansionist wars, and this role expanded after 1857. And indeed, the British encouraged this military cooperation. They formed, for example, the Imperial Service Troops Scheme, where princely regiments would work with British army units to fight outside of India in places like East Africa and Southeast Asia. And this actually happened in the South African War between 1899 and 1902, the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900, and in both world wars. The princes also funded war efforts directly. They gave money to the imperial cause. The Nizam of Hyderabad was probably the most generous, giving over 4 million rupees to Britain's imperial wars. Yet, let's think about it. There was a contradiction inherent in the system of indirect rule. I mean, a modernizing British Raj that supports backward feudal princes? This was an inherent contradiction and tension within indirect rule. The British wanted to maintain what was practically a feudal order that coexisted with their modernizing state. The British, also had to show that they were modern and that they brought development as they continually championed themselves. This was a contradiction in indirect rule that was never resolved till the British left India in 1947. So this was a very delicate balancing act. The British didn't want to push the notion of administrative reform too hard on princes. And some viceroys were certainly more amenable than others, and some treated princes with much more respect. Some viceroys, though, treated Indian princes like rebellious, rambunctious schoolboys. Lord Curzon was probably the best example. When he left India in 1905, the Maharaja of Mysore said, quote, "Bon voyage, may India never see the likes of you again." So it raises the question, were the princes dominated or were they willing collaborators? Well, the answer is a tough one, and there's no easy answer. On the one hand, the princes were surrounded largely by British territory. Militarily, the British Indian Army was the dominant force in the subcontinent. It had a standing army of over 200,000 soldiers, remember. They had numerous instruments of intimidation. Like district collectors, residents could use the threat of force and intimidation to, quote, bring princes into line. On the other hand, many Indians certainly identified with this British ornamentalism and support for princes. Some, such as the Nizam of Hyderabad, were so loyal that they supplied substantial support and manpower throughout the two world wars. Some didn't even want the British to leave in 1947. So in spite of this balancing act, the British and the princes both had common fears which brought them together, somewhat. Now think about it. What did both the British and the princes have in common, particularly as we move beyond 1900? Well, anything that seemed too unsettling, too populist, or that challenged traditional authority. The British and the princes were somewhat united in their fear of the Indian masses, whether they be Hindu reformers and revivalists, peasant agitators, urban labor movements, or Indian nationalists led by Gandhi. The Indian princes knew that anything involving the Indian masses meant their traditions and ways of ruling would be done with. And indeed, as we'll see, the princes and the Raj remained loyal to each other through most of the challenging periods of Gandhi's mobilizations and mass nationalism. So, in this lecture, we've looked at the origins of the princely states and the changes in British attitudes towards them between the 18th and 20th centuries. We saw how the British cultivated ties of loyalty with these princes, and how and why so many of them became staunch loyalists to the Raj and the British crown. So the British didn't technically cover 2/5 of the Indian subcontinent, but through cultivating loyalty, symbolism, and traditional authority, combined with selective uses of state power, the Raj was able to rule the remaining parts of India on the cheap. The British used the princely states, indirectly ruled, as counterweights to those in India who wanted to shake things up and mobilize the masses. And they used the princes against those who had other ideas as to how India should eventually be governed.